Welcome to our session on the contributions of Henri G. Manne. It's a great pleasure to have Henri here to participate in the festivities. So, of course, that limits what we can say, but we'll be as direct and blunt as we usually are. So the idea behind the session was a couple of things. In some conversations that Henri and I had had in recent months, he had on more than one occasion expressed call them latent Austrian tendencies. And I thought, well, it might be a good idea to encourage these. And some of the work that he's done, well, in fact, as you'll see going back to his earliest work, there are strong Austrian themes running through many of his contributions to economics and to law. And so I think I had the idea, I said, well, what if you come to the Austrian Scholars Conference, we have a discussion of some of your contributions from an Austrian perspective, and you can find out just how Austrian you really are. So we'll see at the end of the session if you consider that an honor or a curse. But we have several distinguished panelists. Not myself, but try to count who's better. So we have myself, Alex Padilla, Rich Vedder, Tom DiLorenzo, and then Henri himself. Another reason for doing the session is that Liberty Fund has just put out a 3-volume set called The Collected Works of Henri Manne. I understand we have copies of these in the bookstore downstairs. If you're interested in buying one, I think you can even probably arrange to get an autographed copy for the right price. And in honor of the publication of these volumes, we thought that would be another good reason. It's a good time for us to do sort of an assessment of some of Henri's contributions to economics and to law, and to think about their relationship to Austrian themes. Very briefly, Henri was educated at Vanderbilt as an undergraduate at University of Chicago Law School, where I understand Hayek was teaching at Chicago at that time, and I understand you attended some classes or seminars from Hayek, and then later received a doctoral degree from Yale in law. He has taught at a number of academic institutions: St. Louis University, Wisconsin, George Washington, Rochester, Miami, Emory, and then at George Mason Law School, where he was the dean of the law school from 1986 to 1996 and remained as a professor for a few years after that. And after spending some happy years in retirement in Florida, has decided to start teaching again at Ave Maria Law School in Florida. I don't know if you can see the slides at the bottom in the back there, but we'll have some discussion of work that Henri has done, not only in pure scholarship, but also in institution building. And he was responsible for setting up the first formalized programs in the economic analysis of law, both research programs and also teaching training programs as well. So he established an economic institute for law professors in 1971, and then the first Law and Economics Center, originally at the University of Miami in the mid-'70s. It was then moved to Emory University in the early '80s, where one of Henri's deputies was a certain Lou Rockwell. He moved the center to George Mason when he went there in 1986. Also, since the mid-'70s, has been running the Economics Institute for Federal Judges. So these are programs that I think Tom will talk a little bit more about that are involved in training lawyers and judges in basic economic principles. The way we've organized the session is I've asked each of the panelists, each of the 4 commentators, to focus on a specific area of contribution. I'll speak a little bit about the theory of the corporation, focusing in particular on Henri's extremely influential work on the market for corporate control. His 1965 article in the Journal of Political Economy is still the landmark, still the classic reading on the market for corporate control. I was just looking on Google Scholar yesterday. I don't think this is right. It has 1,971 sites, but I think that's low. Should be quite a few more than that. But it's... You put in Henri G. Maybe I should have put in Henri G. Manne. It's one of the most heavily cited articles in this area. In fact, one of the first papers that I ever published was a chapter in the Elgar Companion to Austrian Economics dealing with these same themes, and I titled it Mergers in the Market for Corporate Control. And in Professor Manny's honor, you can see it has slightly fewer citations than the original article. I'll talk a little bit about that and make a few remarks about the economics and politics of corporate law and a little bit on regulation. Alex Padilla will make some remarks on insider trading. Rich Vedder will talk about education, higher education, the economic organization of higher ed. And Tom DiLorenzo will focus on Henry's activities as an academic entrepreneur. So I'll go first and talk a little bit about the corporation. Before I do that, some general characteristics of what you might call the Manny style, which I think are interesting. Whereas most academics, not only in law or economics, but in almost every field, tend to focus on very narrow technical details, partly for reasons of professional advancement, partly because of other institutional pressures. But Henri Manne is one of those, like Mises, Rothbard, and so on, with an interest and willingness to tackle sort of really big fundamental issues. And one of his newer papers called Free Market Model of a Large Corporation System, I think is a good example of this, where he sort of proceeds through the thought experiment. Imagine a world in which there was no business or corporate regulation, a world in which there's only sort of common law provisions against fraud and so on. What would such a system, what kind of companies, what kind of organizations would emerge and thrive in a system like that? It's a thought experiment that most scholars in economics and law don't have much interest in, but it's something that's very powerful and important for understanding what we have today and why we have it. He's always had strong interdisciplinary interests. As one of the founders of the field of law and economics, that much is obvious. But in his programs, in his writings, and also his academic programs to teach lawyers and judges how to think like economists, but also to get economists thinking about the role of the law, corporate law in particular, he has always worked on the boundaries of the disciplines of economics and law in ways that are very important and interesting. He's an original thinker, and many of his insights have the character, much like, for example, Mises' insight on the impossibility of economic calculation or rational economic planning under socialism, when all factors of productions are commonly owned by the state. These kinds of insights, they often seem obvious once you state them. So Henry's insight that the market for ownership and control of companies places limits on the behavior of corporate managers seems obvious, almost trivial in retrospect, but it was great. No one had thought of it or written it down before his early work, and it was much resisted even at that time. Harold Demsetz has said the following: "A few scholars can lay claim to a discovery of the workings of unsuspected economic forces," referring here to the forces in the market for corporate control. "Even fewer scholars have the words by which they identify their discovery become an indelible part of the language of a field of investigation. Manny's market for corporate control is just such a discovery." His work is also, I think, pretty accessible. He avoids sort of hyper-specialized technical jargon that one finds in some legal scholarship and even in financial economics and so on, corporate law, but has always written not only for a scholarly audience, but has been interested in communicating to the general public as well. I think that's very important. What is the theory of the firm? What is his contribution to our understanding of the firm? Well, it's important to remember that in the late 50s and early 60s, when Henry began writing on these topics, the dominant view of the corporation was the one that came out of Burley and Means' famous book from the 1930s called The Modern Corporation and Private Property, which argued or popularized the importance of this alleged separation between ownership and control. The idea that owners of a corporation, small dispersed shareholders, were not in a position to exercise control over the assets that they own. The control was delegated to hired managers who would operate the firm to their own benefit in whatever ways they wished. Burley, in particular, thought that the corporation should be viewed as a kind of political entity, that because shareholders were unable to exercise, to have much authority over managers, firms should operate like political entities where their object, instead of pursuing profit maximization, they should be pursuing broader social goals. Shareholders should be treated like voters in a democracy. So a lot of the modern literature on so-called stakeholder approaches to corporate governance is really a rehash of these ideas that were very popular from the Depression until the early 1960s. And so one of Henry's contributions in this area was to remind us that the corporation, the firm in general, the corporation in particular, is fundamentally an economic institution, not a political institution. In other words, the behavior of firms is guided, is governed, is constrained in fundamental ways by markets, by the voluntary actions of market participants. For example, managers, managerial positions are open for competition. So firms hire managers, they fire managers. Shareholders are not, unlike citizens who are born into a particular nation, shareholders don't just sort of wake up one day and find that they're owners of IBM, right? They make decisions to become owners or non-owners in their choices to acquire or to buy and sell equities in financial markets. Many shareholders choose not to exercise all of their governance and control rights because it's in their interest to delegate some of these rights to others. Small shareholders can free ride, so to speak, on the decisions of better informed large block holders and so on. And that this is in the interest of small shareholders. His work on the market for corporate control, most famously articulated in the 65 article, explains how financial markets, how asset markets, equity markets place very strong constraints on the discretionary activities of corporate managers. And he was one of the first to provide an economic rationale for financial market participants that are, named by the media as a pejorative, corporate raiders, people who buy and sell equities in order to take control of distressed companies, underperforming companies, turn them around, and so on. Figures like this, even in the 1950s, were widely reviled as sort of rapacious, greedy, people who were getting rid of harming the widows and orphans and firing the workers and so on. And Henry's work on the role that these market participants play shows that they do have a very important and sort of social welfare enhancing purpose. It's also famous for, in this context, for the role of trading by informed insiders, and Alex will tell us more about that. Also did some very important work comparing different organizational forms, the diffusely held public corporation compared to the more closely held privately owned firm. What are some of the Austrian themes in Manny's work on the firm, on the corporation? Well, I've always enjoyed this, or placed emphasis on a quote from Mises in Human Action, where Mises is discussing socialism. And this is the part where he's addressing some of the critics of his original argument published in the 1920s, in the 1920 article in the 1922 book, about the impossibility of rational resource allocation under socialism. And the market socialists had proposed a number of means of addressing this problem, trying to come up with sort of fake markets or pseudo-markets for some factors, for consumer goods and so on, to try to simulate the workings of a market economy. And many of these market socialists argued that, well, in an advanced industrial economy, firms aren't run by entrepreneurs. They're run by salaried managers who don't own the firms that they operate, who don't have big equity stakes. Why would it be any different for the manager of a socialist factory? You just tell him to arrange things in a certain way to try to equate marginal revenue and marginal cost. Isn't that just what corporate managers do? Why would market socialism of that type be any worse than capitalism under the corporate form? And Mises argues, I think quite persuasively, that this argument, the market socialist argument, completely overlooks the role of financial markets, of capital markets, in performing the vital function of directing resources to particular enterprises. In other words, Mises argues that sort of the problem of, given that we have a plant or a factory set up, and it has a certain amount of capital allocated to it, how do you get the manager to direct the employees so that they produce the right amount of output? Mises says that is a second-order problem. That's a minor problem in a market economy. The real problem that is solved under capitalism addresses how did that plant come to be there in the first place? Why is there a firm in this location producing these outputs and not some other outputs? Why does it use this technology and not that technology? Why is it this size and not that size? Why is it here and not there? Why does it exist at all? Those functions, even under these market socialist proposals, would have to be performed by some kind of central planning board that would be unable to use market signals to make these decisions effectively. And Mises puts it this way. He's essentially referring to Burleigh means, though he doesn't name them. He says this Burleigh means doctrine, separation of ownership and control, disregards entirely the role that the capital and money market, the stock and bond exchange, which a pertinent idiom simply calls the market, plays in the direction of corporate business. The changes in the prices of common and preferred stock and of corporate bonds are the means applied by the capitalists for the supreme control of the flow of capital. The price structure, as determined by speculations on the capital and money markets and on the big commodity markets, big commodity exchanges, not only decides how much capital is available for the conduct of each corporation's business, it creates a state of affairs to which the managers must adjust their operations in detail. In other words, it is the actions of these capitalists in financial markets, in capital and money markets, that create the environment within which managers manage their enterprises. And that critical function cannot be duplicated in a centrally planned economy, according to Mises. He actually remarks that no economy can be considered truly a market economy unless it has a stock market. No matter how many pseudo-markets for labor or consumer goods there may be, the real action, according to Mises, is in the financial markets. The real capitalist action is in the financial markets, not the product market, not the market for labor, and so on. That's a very a Manny-ish insight. Henri has also written on Hayekian themes, the importance of tacit, dispersed knowledge, particularly where Hayek, as Hayek in Use of Knowledge in Society, for example, characterizes market prices as embodying information about relative scarcities and so on. This notion of prices as market prices as signals. Henri has built this into his understanding of share prices and written on the role of prices of shares of companies as being signals about embodying tacit, dispersed tacit knowledge about goings-on within particular companies. So financial market participants who are evaluating various corporate activities need not know all of the tacit knowledge inside a particular enterprise to the extent that that is encapsulated in the prices of the equities. So it's an explicitly Hayekian theme. Just a few other things. Mises' book on bureaucracy, I think, is one of Mises' least appreciated books. Has a lot of insight on the political economy of business law and business structure, and there, which themes that you see echoed in many of Henri's writings. You reminded me of this. I didn't remember, but even in his 1966 book on insider trading, there's some discussion of the role of the profits from insider trading as a reward for entrepreneurial action. So before economists, even Austrian economists, began to emphasize entrepreneurship as they did, for example, after Kerzner's highly influential 1973 book on the entrepreneur, Henri was writing about the gains from insider trading being a compensation scheme for entrepreneurial services in large corporations. Also found interesting a very Hayekian sort of evolutionary account of corporate structure in a 1982 paper that's included in the collected works, where Henri says the following. He says the lesson, he's talking about Hayek's law, legislation, and liberty. He says the lesson from Hayek's account is that we should always proceed very cautiously before meddling with complex institutions that represent the outcome of long periods of evolution. The list of institutions Hayek described, the family, law, and language, do not include the corporation, though it might well have. Here's the key Hayekian sort of insight. There is a rationality in these institutions, but it is not the rationality of invention or positive planning by identifiable individuals that are sort of design the corporate system in a top-down fashion. Rather, these institutions are the result of innumerable individuals, each with specialized information, acting as best he can to better himself. So this is a very sort of Hayekian notion of spontaneous order So the nature of the corporation, the form of the corporation being the outcome of the kind of spontaneous order processes about which Hayek wrote. Our speakers will not only summarize the work, but also maybe push it in some new directions and maybe offer some critiques from an Austrian perspective. Just a few things that I suspect, I haven't seen much of this in print, but some things that Austrians and maybe some libertarians or classical liberals, questions or challenges they might have for some of Henri's writing. Is there more of a distinction between risk and uncertainty than one finds in most of the discussion of insider trading? Mises in particular seemed to place a lot of emphasis on, though he didn't use exactly this terminology, on what Frank Knight describes as judgmental decision-making by entrepreneurs. It's different from sort of rational utility maximization under conditions of probabilistic risk. Maybe there's a little bit more attention to the distinction between risk and uncertainty might be useful here. There's some Austrian writers on organizations who have taken a very strong line that corporate hierarchy itself is akin to a kind of central planning. That sort of the modern corporation with its central staff and its directives and so on is a very old-fashioned, highly bureaucratic structure by nature, and that sort of Austrian economists would claim that we would expect to see much more decentralized, flatter, so to speak, organizations, small networks of independent producers, things like open source communities in the software world, maybe worker-owned cooperatives and so on, that those are more consistent with our beliefs about the importance of decentralization and so on. I happen not to share that view. I think that view is misguided, but I think you see it quite often in the Austrian community, and that might be something that you want to make a remark about. I guess I'm taking more time than I wanted. I'll close with some critiques that have been offered within some libertarian circles about the legal status of the corporation. And it is commonly argued by libertarians that the sort of enabling statutes, that the idea of the corporation as a legal fiction as a legal person is in fact a kind of a grant of state privilege. And they focus in particular on limited liability, not so much limited liability in the creditor sense, but limited liability for torts. Claim that, well, in a truly free market society, there would be no limited liability for corporate entities. And that the reason the corporation is the dominant form of organization today is because it enjoys a host of special privileges, such as legal personhood status, limited liability. People like Kevin Carson claim that government subsidies of infrastructure and transportation have sort of artificially benefited large organizations that have economies of scale and so on. That in the absence of subsidies for transportation and infrastructure, the optimal size of the organization will be much smaller than it is under our sort of mixed economy kind of system.